Hello, friends, and welcome to Igniting Imagination. I'm your host, Lisa Greenwood, and this season, our theme is Healing the World Through New Models of Ministry. Our co host, Amy Butler, is certainly doing this herself in so many ways. And one is through her organization, Invested Faith. And we are very grateful to welcome some of the Invested Faith Fellows on the podcast this season. Amy, thank you for co-hosting. Thank you for your ministry. It's great to be doing this with you.
These conversations have been so life-giving for me, Lisa. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and our fellows.
Yes. And if you all didn't catch the first episode, I hope you'll go back and listen. Amy and I visit about the origins of Invested Faith and what it means to be an Invested Faith Fellow. And we talk about her new book, co-authored with Dawn Darwin Weeks. The title is Holy Disruption, a Manifesto for Future Faith Communities. I am so anxious to read your book when it comes out. And I'm wondering if the focus of our conversation today with Josh Hayashi and church property transition, if you will, is somehow connected to the manifesto in your book, either directly or indirectly. So
Yes.
Can you talk about what you think when you hear holy disruption right alongside church property? Yeah.
Right. So as you'll hear, Josh is just in the thick of it. We're running test groups now around Holy Disruption, which is a resource for faith communities. And one of the points of feedback that we keep getting is, why do you have to use such upsetting language? Disruption and manifesto and Lisa, you know me well enough to know that I chose those words specifically to rile people up, because when we get to the point where we're talking about the urgency of what to do with our properties, with the physical space that has been church, there's so many issues that require taking off layers and really disruption. And
Disrupting.
it's deeply uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So it goes hand in hand, and we'll hear a little more about that and what it causes. But anyway, as we have mentioned, our guest today is Josh Hayashi. And Amy, I'd love for you to share a little bit more about Josh.
I'm so excited that you'll get to hear about Josh's work, and you will hear soon as you listen that Josh and I are friends. We work and live in the same community on the same island. Josh is ordained clergy in the United Church of Christ, and he's a local school chaplain. But in his free time, he runs a company called Mission Management, which works with churches to use a digital tool to assess their runway, the amount of time they have left if they kept going the way they were going, and then to look at different factors like their financial health, the community in which they're serving, the needs of the people around them, and then the property that they are in possession of, and then think, like, what is it that we could do? And who is it that we could be in this space as a redemptive presence? You'll hear that he reminds us that the church in our country has been the birthplace of so many socially nurturing institutions, schools and hospitals and preschools and all kinds of programs. And he reminds us this is an opportunity that we can't lay down. It's still there. So when we're thinking about what to do with our properties, we want to think about what our mission is and what our values are and who we're called to be in the world. Josh is a friend, and he works with me in this Indigenous culture, and we're always thinking about how our Hawaiian setting and culture informs the work that we do. And you'll hear a little more about the cultural setting in which he works. But his country, Mission Management, works across the country with churches who are thinking about their property and trying to look at it in new ways.
And I also want to add that Josh is a 2025 Locke Innovative Leader Award recipient, and we could not be more thrilled to welcome Josh into the Locke Leader community. So, Amy, what stood out to you in this conversation with Josh?
Well, I think that Josh's work is at one of the most tender points of
Mm.
where we as people of faith find ourselves in our institutional dynamic right now. And I really just enjoyed hearing the truth and being able to go into that tender place of some of our institutions will not continue, and that is
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
And so every time he allows us the opportunity to say that and hear it and talk about it, it makes me breathe with a little sense of relief. And I
yeah,
hope our listeners will feel that too. He kept
yeah.
saying, "It's not your fault."
Yeah, which is such a compassionate statement, right? There's such care and compassion in the way that he enters into this. So I confess the first couple of times that I talked with Josh, I thought, oh, this tool is really cool, and it's this data collection and it's using technology to help churches think about their church property. And so I'm thinking, Josh, the problem solver and the guy who looks at data and technical, and every conversation I have opens up deeper layers about his theology, about his deep care for individuals and their holistic well-being. And this conversation did that same thing. But I just think we ought not miss that, like, every church and how they're thinking about their property is a deeper, deeper question about their purpose, about how they, utilize their assets in ways that make a difference in their neighborhood with their neighbors. That's the question. This tool is all about that. Anyway, I that was reinforced in this conversation.
I think we'll make a mistake if we look at Josh and the work that he's doing as five steps to fixing your church. There's so much more depth here and layers for us to mine as we think honestly about where we are.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. So let's listen to our conversation with Josh. Josh, I'm so glad to be visiting with you today. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. I'm stoked to be here. It's exciting.
Great. Great. Well, I want to jump right in and ask you to share a little bit of the backstory of Mission Management Company. How did you come to to start the organization and what led to that? Um, and while you're doing that, you might give us a little 101 about what it
Okay.
is.
Yeah, so mission management has some iterations over time, but right now, and I think this is the path that we're going to continue to stay on, is that we are really um, a company that creates digital tools to help judicatories and churches and consultants and denominations really connect the great intentions, the values, the hopes of the local church, along with secular partners, whether that's banks, financial institutions, municipalities, nonprofit organizations, in order to do God's work in the neighborhood, to kind of help bring a partnership and a common language so that the church can address some of these needs that are right around them. So we provide these digital tools in order to do that. So a little bit about how that,
Okay, there's so much to
yeah.
to unpack in that. But yeah, okay, you're going to jump in. Go right ahead
Oh,
with
okay.
how you
Oh yeah.
started.
So I my dad was a pastor. I grew up in the church, and I've also professionally have done other things. I was a school counselor or at-risk counselor at a Title I school, and in fact, it was there in some ways that my job was to go in the morning. It was right after my undergrad. I was in graduate school in a school counseling program on the west side of the island, which has a lot more poverty. And my job was to go in the morning and knock on the door of some of these houses where the kids had not come to school yet. And some of these children, mom and dad was on the couch, passed out on ice, and they'd say, "Here's Hayashi," like the grandparents would yell that, and I would have to go and take that kid and walk him to school, and really realizing. Then we went on
Wow.
strike. That our teachers union went on strike for 3 weeks, and I kind of had this
Mm,
realization that for me anyway, our public institutions have failed the ability for so many people to be able to kind of um, move children out of some of these situations. I mean, I was doing it. I felt
mm,
like I was doing a lot of work, working with social workers, working with police officers, and all these other kinds of things. But being able to look at a family holistically, being able to give hope for what the future, and I felt
mm,
like this is not really what I want to do, and so I feel like God was saying, you know what, your dad was a pastor, you have all these family members that were ministers, let's go to seminary. So I went to Regent College in Vancouver, Canada. And I had this really interesting experience. The church that I was interning at, they let me do a joint internship at a local school. So my job was I don't like a role in the school to connect refugee families to families in the church. So Vancouver at that time had a lot of
wow.
families from like Eastern Europe that were coming after the war in Bosnia Herzegovina and other places. And so my job is to connect those church families to be host families to these school families. And it was
Mm,
it was a wonderful experience. And I worked in the church too. And so I kind of always had this feeling that my job was to be in between the church and the world in a way.
mm,
Came back to Hawaii. I was working at a school as a school chaplain, and started consulting with churches who wanted to kind of figure out, what do we do? We're getting older. Young people, right? So they're probably older. And kind of really realizing that there was a real need to talk about these spaces. Hawaii, like a lot of urban areas across the world, has such high real estate values, especially on these church
mm,
properties with incredible legacies and histories. And nobody was really doing anything about it. And I could see that, in 20 years, I would be driving around Honolulu and seeing all these abandoned churches.
mm,
And I kind of shared this. I'm part of the UCC, United Church of Christ, here in Honolulu. I'm ordained, but for those of us who are ordained under the age of 60 that are from Hawaii, there are only two people working in churches, and Amy is one of them, and the other one is Carrie Ann Maeda, and
wow.
both of them had just moved back to Hawaii within the last 2 years. So
Wow.
it's
Wow.
so there's all these multiple things happening in the system, as we all know, right? Seminaries are down, leadership, a lot of changes, cultural changes. But really, really realizing like what I could do was I could see how a space, the organizational capacities of the church, how often they met, conflict, all these things, how how it could be connected into the needs of the local neighborhood. And not just in an abstract way, but what the actual nonprofits were doing, what the municipalities needed, how they put their funding priorities. But in order to do that, we needed data to be able to connect all those
Mm,
dots. And so brought on a partner, and we created a way to kind of do that online. And so really using data and reports and training church adjacent leaders to be able to go and reach out to these churches and giving them a 360-degree view of the church around them and inside of them to create partnerships. Now that's a lot. So we can stop at any point there, but
Yeah, no, it's beautiful because you've shared your heart, kind of those beginning seeds of the need, the very tangible, here are families and the holistic needs of those children, their education, their nutrition, their
housing,
transportation,
yeah,
like their family system, their house, like, you know, took a hold of your heart, in a way led you into ministry, and still connected with the school and with kids, and their families, and then it's this, on the surface it could be a big jump to church property and an app, a tech process, a data gathering process that helps churches. But I'm hearing you say it's not. It's how do we help the church be as strong as it can be in order to be a neighbor, in order to, really be part of an ecosystem that helps not abstractly, but very tangibly families and individuals have, sort of for the sake of well-being, holistic
Yeah.
well-being, and that the church is a part of that. And the church has some real kind of desperate needs that are an obstacle to showing up in their neighborhoods. Am I
Yeah,
saying that
I think
back?
that's exactly right. I do want to say too, like a big part of what I love is history. And so there's a guy that
Mm,
lived here. He was a missionary that came from Japan to work the Japanese, um, to evangelize the Japanese when they in the 1890s and early 1900s. And he came and started really his ministry started at the Great Chinatown Fire. So there's a Chinatown fire in
mm,
Honolulu, and because of his work, like this hospital started, this other private school started, the first AJA
mm.
baseball league, which is now mostly on the West Coast of the United States. Um, all these different like the YMCA started, all these social institutions
Wow.
that church, and that's just one person, right? Like most of our
Mhm,
towns and our social institutions were started by church people. You think about
mm,
Rotary, right? You think about the local school. You think about the local hospital. You think about we actually were on the forefront of that up until the war, until World War II, building all of
mm.
these social institutions, and then we left them for some reason, and we
Mm.
became much more focused on
Yeah.
church as a social gathering and it being holistic to us. And so that was kind of a big. It's I don't feel like it's. I feel like we're trying to go back to that. Even Alexis de Tocqueville talked about that when he talked about the United States, right? Like every person is a president of some social institution. Every person is trying to do better and do good in its
Mm,
community. But I think we have lost that part of it. The frameworks for all those things are still there in the American town. It's just a matter of telling that story, and hopefully our people in our churches to be able to see that they were at the heart of all of these things in their local communities. And it's time to go back because the neighborhoods need us now more than ever to do that again.
So listeners should know that Josh and I have in common, we are neighbors. We live on the same island here in Hawaii, and I like to think of Hawaii as sort of a microcosm of the larger American landscape when it comes to religious institutions. It is true that we have very few young pastors, and um, Josh is always telling that statistic, and people here say, "I wish you would just stop saying that," and 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 it's true, and it's also sad and hard, and pretty soon I'll be over 60 and your statistic will get worse. Um,
mm,
but like any other place with the overlaps of colonialism and indigenous stresses, we are facing the decline of our religious institutions, and exactly what you said, Josh, about you know we have sort of surrendered the opportunity to be good neighbors and to help and support the other institutions that are serving our community. So that has led us to decline in a lot of ways, just like every church in America. So take us through the process. What would happen if a church came to you and said, we have this property, it's worth a lot of money, we don't have any people left, we're not sure what step to take next.
Totally. So, so first of all, I'd say you're not alone, and this is not necessarily your fault. Okay, so I think
mm,
that's important. This is something that's happening in general, and that's important because a lot of people have this incredible burden that we can't let everything fall under our watch or whatever that is. But we're actually trying to bring on more and more people who, no matter where they are in the country, they have a trusted advisor, either at the adjudicatory level or a consultant who knows their area well enough that can use our tool and help them. But if they were to come to us, we would say, hey, so this is what we're doing. We're gonna give you a 61 question online survey, which only your pastor has to take or your treasurer has to take, and those have financial questions and property related questions. But to your leadership team or your council or your board or whatever that is, here are 14 questions to ask. And it should be relatively quick, 20 minutes at the most. And then we put that into we take those numbers and we run it through just different weightings and it all different kinds of questions. But it really gets at where the church is organizationally. Like the question is not so much what do we do, but can we partner and then transform? Because the reality is the churches now can't transform alone anymore. So I go to Amy's church, and Amy's church or our church is under a time of transformation right now. But it would not be in that place without a leader like Amy. And so there's not going to be any other Amy's coming to uh, all these churches in Hawaii and other places, really. But it could be another kind of partner. It could be a preschool partner. It could be a food incubator. It could be um, a housing developer, affordable housing developer, something that would be a good mission aligned partner. It could be a bank. It could be another congregation, but they're not going to think their way out of it by themselves. And so our tool kind of helps determine how partnerable are they in general, but also who are some good partners for them to look at, and then how to make that transformative change organizationally.
So that's the tool, and that's the data that we begin with. We all know that there's a whole emotional level and relational level that is involved in dealing with institutional transformation, and especially churches.
Yeah.
I have seen you in the room with church leadership teams and a lot of conflict and fear and grief. You know, your tool and your work is about data and statistics and areas that we can take opportunities. How do you pastor your way through a, a digital tool like this and help people with their grief and pain?
Well, I think it's really important that to continue to say, we are a Christian group, and that resurrection always follows death. That's part of it. And whether that's death of our expectations, death of our hope, what we were hoping would come. For so many of our churches, they are hoping for this new heir to come, or the heir that they had expectations about. But that's a very, very biblical thing, right? Like over and over, the people of Israel or families in the Bible were hoping for this specific heir, and they had to look this way to come and take over the legacy, or take over Israel, or take over Abraham's family line. And always God brought somebody or something that was completely unexpected. And so this is something that's not just to us now, but it has always been. And so even though in most cases it will not be our children and grandchildren coming to take over our role as head of the board in our church, which we were hoping for, or to lead worship in our church, it will be somebody or something else, if we are open to that. And that's God's spirit. And so I think that's the hope, is that we're giving them the opportunity to say, something's going to come, but we have to be open to. So that's part of it, that the data gathering is really about listening. What is actually able to happen? How do we open ourselves up, not just spiritually, but organizationally and functionally, in order to hear God's spirit? I think that's a good part. The other thing too is that part of our thing is that we have the congregation as part of our tool is to rank what we call the organizational values. Oftentimes conflict comes over when we have in church, we use very abstract language to talk about our most important things: evangelism, discipleship, reaching children. However, because it's still on the abstract, it allows us to imbue different feelings into that. One of the things that we bring out really clearly is we say that the actual values that guide churches and these types of decisions about the future are the ones that happen in the parking lot by usually the one or two men after the meeting, those business people, that former attorney or whoever that is. And when we talk about those values, long-term financial stability, how important Sunday morning service is, um, what our legacy is to the community, what kind of partnerships we have, people needs, it kind of depersonalizes some of those discussions. We're not going to change the culture of the church, but we want to change how they function in order that they can be open to what happens next. So I think that that's kind of part of it, is that we're not trying to not hear the conversations. I mean, the grief and the listening, that's so important. But whoever is guiding, that's why we like to train people to do it. Whoever is guiding them has to be aware of the hope of the future, but they need to hear this. I think the other thing too, and this is part of the challenge for so many of us, is that in many of these cases, the churches will actually die. But to be really clear about that, you to be able to say to our congregation, you actually only have a 2-year window left. And how do we pause for a second and we let God's Spirit actually move in that moment and say, well, what about resurrection then? What could happen out of that? Because they obviously will need to process that. And so that's part of our process too, is that we create these conversations so that the the churches can, and people alongside, can walk alongside of them to have these really important and challenging conversations. But some of them won't be. Some of them, like, based on the kinds of data that we have about your property, or based on what your property and all these other things, you're so attracted to everyone. People are knocking on the door to renovate you and to make something new out of this, and you will have families in here for the next 3 generations or whatever that is. But until they know what the realities or possibilities are, it's the anxiety of what they feel like they don't see that's driving the conversation.
I what you're describing aligns with something that we often share with leaders, that the first task of a leader is to paint an accurate picture of current reality. Like, that truth telling is actually a really important and compassionate step to moving into the future. And I'm curious how people react. Like, if like when they see the data and you're trying to give them an accurate picture of current reality, you're trying to help them face their truth and then put that truth in the sort of larger narrative story of what it means to be faithful, what it means to trust in God's leading and God's provision, and understanding that sort of the arc of death and resurrection, all those things. I'm curious what it's like when you give the data and people hear it.
Yeah, I think there's two parts to
Yeah.
that. One is that we have a very weak theology about incarnation. So 9 times out of 10,
That's
right? We
sad.
don't, right? Because this is a lot like going to the doctor, and we don't want to hear that we have a heart condition. And even if we do, we don't necessarily want to do things about that. So this is actually related to that. We don't know how to think about
Interesting.
God. Actually, God cares about the stuff. God cares about our world, our environment. That's why climate change is you can edit that out if you want, is a real deal. But this is part of that conversation, that this is at the heart of it. It's a theological issue. It's what the stuff matters, and not only Sunday morning worship matters. So I think that's part of it. The other part, and this is much more like sociological, is 9 times out of 10, what is happening in the church structure and these conversations is mirroring the congregants in their actual lives.
Yes. Yeah.
And so one conversation I
Yes.
had with a gentleman at a church was like, my kids took my car away from me. I had to move to a new place. This is the last place I have control.
Yes.
And I said, this the hard part. I said, I know that's true, but you could be helping so many people with this in a way that is I mean, there is an aspect of that we have to call out. Part of this is sin on their end. It's just
Yeah.
selfishness. I mean, I shouldn't say it like that. A need to have control. And our
It's very
it's very
human,
human.
isn't it?
It's also very biblical,
Gosh.
right? There is this like in the over and over God's people again got stuck on what they thought heaven was, right?
Mm.
When they left Egypt and they're wandering in the desert and they said, "Why don't we have fruit and meat?"
Yeah, it just makes me think, Josh, like, I so appreciate you just saying the truth. And then how do we respond to people who say, but, you know, helping a neighborhood school is not church, Josh.
And then we
That
can say,
it's
yeah,
it's
yeah. But you
it's not
you
the
know,
stained glass that my grandma put in. So what are you talking about?
yeah. But your great grandma helped found that school, right? Like that's the thing.
Mm,
And she would have
mm,
cared about what's happening because she was an immigrant herself.
mm.
And I think that's
We're so scared of the movement of God, aren't we? Tell us a story, Josh. Tell us about a congregation that used your tool
Yeah.
and made some progress.
so I think one was that and Amy knows this story, but it was this little congregation, three aunties left in this little fishing village on Maui called this town called Kenai. There's like 40 families there. And it's on the road to Hana, so many people would know that road. It's a lot of tourists. Thousands of tourists travel that road every day. Um, but in this little congregational church, which is almost 200 years old, the three aunties continued to meet, and their roof had fallen in, so they're meeting in the social hall. And so the Hawaii Conference Foundation, which is the entity that is fiduciarily and legally responsible for the property, called me and asked to help. And so we had this. I would fly over there about once a month for about 6 months, and we had these really important discussions and talk about, let's look at your finances. Let's look at, what's happening. Let's look at the needs of the community. And in that, it was actually really complicated at first because you have this outsider coming in. I mean, even though I'm from Hawaii, I am not from Kenai, and there's a big difference.
I was gonna say you're outside
Yeah,
the
yeah,
village. You are
completely.
not our people.
So I needed someone
Wow.
to help me get my way in that, to respect them. So that was really important. But through the process and people getting upset and worried we're going to sell the property and do these things, actually able to, this granddaughter of one of the three aunties came back into the town, said, I'm moving back. I want to help her and I want to help take care of of the
Mm,
church. And she said, but I want to do it a little bit differently. And so we helped her. She had this vision about capturing all the tourist traffic that was coming in by doing a farmer's market. And so, because it primarily in that little village were people that were farming their own goods, and it was a way to connect the needs of all those peoples in the community with the tourist group, but also the church as the center of that activity. So a farmers market meeting once a month, and the helping that young woman be able to create a legal partnership with the church itself, and the monthly income that was coming back to the church was more than the church received all year. So that's just one example. I mean, we're working with other churches. That one church in Cincinnati went through the tool, and we helped them connect them with a local food incubator. And so they had a commercial kitchen, so we helped them get the permitting for their um for their commercial kitchens. That updated, and then they have a partner coming in. So the moderator of the church called me and he said, "Hey, we're in the black for the first time."
wow.
And it created a partnership with one of our ecumenical financing partners. And but the it once you start to have a conversation about reality and the real things, the finances, the property, it's what it can do and its limitations, then you can actually start to think about what happens next. It's like surgery.
Say more.
Well, I mean, I think sometimes like I would rather like watch YouTube videos and imagine that I'm losing weight that way, right? Whatever that is, right? Like, but I gotta take blood pressure medicine. Like all these things, like I actually
Mm,
have to do.
You have to do the
We have to
things.
do the things. And I am frustrated when I feel like our denominational leaders or different people are not honest with these congregations.
Mm,
Oh yeah, you can build affordable housing. Oh yeah, you can do XYZ. You can bring everybody back. That's not
If
true.
only we
So,
got a pastor who could bring in young families.
right, if only. Right. Yeah. So you used a term earlier, and I love it. You said we kind of are helping assess if they're partnerable. And so what makes a church partnerable?
So a big one is their runway length, like their financial runway length, how much time they actually
Um,
have left. Amy knows this very well. If they have less than a year left, the reality is the most important thing is to start taking care of kind of closing and figuring out what happens next. Did not do that. And
and you assess that through
yeah, the
this
tool will give
tool.
them,
You're looking at
it'll
their
give them,
financial
yeah,
picture.
it'll give them
Yeah.
a runway length. And it's
Okay.
really, it's really high level. Okay. We don't do actuarial tables on their age and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
But, it's at a high level. We can give an approximate amount. Um, so that runway length is really, really important, but also kind of the boundaries of, so I think part of it is churches understanding that their view of their church may not be complete, right? They don't
Mm,
know necessarily how, what the county is thinking about as far as a master plan for affordable housing, right? That's just one
okay.
partner. They're not necessarily knowing that the laws around preschools maybe have changed in their municipality. They may not know that all these other kinds of things that are happening. And so what this does is that it brings them into the conversation about, like, because it's the same language that the partners would use. Like, can they take on a loan? Can they bring on a legally on, like, a partner? Like a lot of times they'll say we want a preschool, but they may not know that they have to be zoned in a certain way,
Mm,
or that they have to be able to be licensable for like a Department of Health licensure or something like that. So
mhm.
many of these things that they don't know about themselves, um, or about their neighborhood, really. So partnerable is like their financial side, then their property side. Because if they want to partner with like
Mm,
a partner that's going to share their property, the partner's going to ask how many square footage. You know, what is
mhm.
the usable space? Is it ADA compliant? Is there parking? Well, how much do you want a month for lease? And right, but most churches don't even have the ability to even answer that question, and so
Right.
it just
Yeah.
stops.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the question I want to ask you as a person of faith and as a leader in the church. We all know what a heavy lift this is. Like, you're providing us the information. For us to take it from information to rebirth is not going to happen in a lot of places. How do you, as a person of faith, keep your hopes alive for the work of
Mm,
God's people and God's institutions in the world?
You know, that's a great question. I mean, I think I was just talking to someone about this, about two people. That one is a researcher who is researching the Catholic Church's holdings in Southeast Asia, and how she kind of shared that the Bishop of the Philippines is in the top 10 of individual wealth holders in the entire country. And in some ways, what's hard is that, and that's what that just goes to says is that we have so many wealth and assets and resources, but they are not helping anybody in so many ways, or they are helping a very, very, very small amount. And so it's easy to get cynical
yeah.
because we are squandering our talents away, when the world is crying out for need. That's the issue of like, um, of challenge. I don't despair um, because God is still doing. I still see like things are happening. There are still people that are wanting to do these things. That we have a lot of people that are, are reaching out to us. I think that's the exciting part. Um, and part of it is like still being involved in a church, and also knowing that God has a good plan. But I am frantically working hard to make sure that, at least some people have a chance to kind of work. And but the bigger thing is that part is it is it is disheartening to see how we have so many of these resources, and yet there's the need is so great, and it is increasing,
Yeah.
and we don't want to
Yeah.
oftentimes hear it, or we're closing our ears to hear it.
Yeah. I so appreciate that question, Amy, and really to hear you, Josh, talk about how you tend your own soul in the midst of what can feel despairing or stuck. And I'm curious what you would say to pastors and leaders who find themselves in a situation in a church that maybe is in decline, maybe there's deferred maintenance, maybe they've even gone through the data piece with y'all and you're trying to think about next steps. Like, what's your, words of wisdom slash compassion slash help to pastors and leaders who find themselves in that place?
I think if they are asking that question, then they are um, they're asking that question because the church is not for the same reason that I am. Um, a lot of them are already in some ways discontent with the church in general.
Mm-hmm.
And for them, I would say like this is just the beginning of
Mm.
Tolkien called it the long defeat, and I love that kind of part of it is that our work is to continue on even though it seems disheartening, but we cannot despair. Um,
Mm.
the part though that's more complicated is the pastor who is so focused on growing their congregation, and they don't want to see the needs of the community. And I think that's and that's there too. I mean and I think part of it is like, what does it mean for us to continue to serve our community? But I think the
Mm.
hope is that what you're saying is that for those folks who are despair, now so many have left the church, these leaders, and I just want to say
Mhm.
that this is not your fault. And the fact that many of us are discontent with the church, that's exactly where we're supposed to be.
Mm.
God has put something inside of you to see the world differently than how we were
Mm.
trained or the church we grew up in. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. You're doing exactly what you're thinking the way you're supposed to be thinking. But also know that that is God calling you back to whatever that was. But it's going to have to be different. And trust that discontent that you have inside of you.
Mm. That holy
That holy
discontent, the
discontent.
place where God
Yeah.
works, does God's best.
Because
Yeah.
I remember talking
Nice.
to this one church in the Midwest, and they're like, we put out a call for a pastor, and um, the only guy that was willing to come in and work full time for us in a pastor, there's only one person. So we got all these applications that people wanted to work part time in the church, but wanted to do like justice work or work in a community kitchen, or that is the bulk of these young people now. And
Yeah.
Amy is doing a really good job of platforming and
Yeah.
finding those folks. So that's that's the real we're heading in. They're not alone. They are not alone in that.
Mhm. Mm. Well, I want to ask you the question that we're asking all of our guests at the end of our each podcast, and it really pulls from the Isaiah text that says, do not consider the things of old. I am doing a new thing. Do you not perceive it? And so, what is an old thing that we need not consider anymore? And what is a new thing God is doing that is springing forth
Mm.
that you're seeing?
Well, I think the old thing is maybe the oldest thing, right? The first heresy was Gnosticism. The
Hmm.
stuff matters. Um, and also this is part of
Interesting.
the thing that's hard. Perspective has a shelf life, and I said this before. Many of our churches, our congregants, leaders, maybe have been retired for 20 years, right? They don't know what it was like to live in a world and work in a world where post COVID or post 9/11 or any of that stuff, post Barack Obama or whatever.
Yeah.
And technology and things have changed the world so much. I, it's hard. It's hard. They don't have the perspective anymore. Not on the most important things, but at least on some of the functional strategic things, just to be clear about that. So our perspectives have to change completely because the world has changed completely. The part that is interesting and exciting but challenging is data, and how technology is allowing us, like, we can scale to reach hundreds, if not thousands, of churches. But that's also kind of a scary thing too. So being wise and also what we say is that it's easier for people to work with churches around what we do, who are church people who learn the skills of technology and real estate and finance. It is much harder to have a finance or a real estate person learn to have the compassion and the vision and the faith of a church person. That's much harder, if not impossible. I've only met a few of those folks. And actually, both of you are examples of that, too. So there's hope for all of those pastors who are out there and feel disaffected and unengaged.
It's such a hopeful word, and I hear you. I hear you saying, like, the new thing that's springing forth actually is in the technology and the data and paying attention to that. And of course you would say that, and I love it. Yeah, so good. Well, thank you, Josh. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for the ministry that you are doing every day.
Thank you.
Yeah, Josh, I just want to say thank you also, and for stepping into this very deeply uncomfortable place where so many of us are afraid to go, and where God is beckoning us, begging us to please come and create something new. That's really an encouraging example for so many of us. So thanks.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an honor. I'm super thankful and excited to have been here with you folks. I think maybe I should share one more thing, but I'm sorry we're running out of time. So my dad was a PCUSA minister, and he was working in a little church, but church politics stuff happened. I was 10, and my dad was put out. He was asked to leave his call. And soon after that, my parents' marriage dissolved as a result of that. And I think for me, like, I don't mind church conflict, partly because of that's just part of life. But I also think, like, I still want to I still have felt called to be a minister in that. But church conflict in and of itself is not the scariest thing, for me specifically. So I think that's a part of my story that I'm still kind of fleshing out. What does that mean? And that's why I don't mind being in these, like, super crazy meetings, because nothing is going to hurt me anymore. Like, I mean, I kind of feel like I've already endured so much of the worst of church conflict.
Right. Yeah. That's powerful in the sense that you have perhaps a trust level that God does and will work in the midst, because that has happened in your life. You have moved through death and resurrection more than once.
But even despite the church, God works.
Yeah,
no, I mean, really, and I think that's in my own life so intimately I can say that.
Yeah. And isn't that the biblical witness too? Like, despite our human efforts and failings, like, God continues to work in and through us, around us. So, yeah. May it be so.
Amen.
Yeah. Thank you.